Hey, yo, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. This is Smart TCG, and today I'm going to be going over my Twilight Masquerade tier list. Twilight Masquerade is the brand new set that is going to be coming out for the Pokemon TCG, and it's going to be changing up the metagame quite a bit. So today, I'm going to be going over all of my thoughts on the metagame, and most notably heading into NAIC. This is going to be the brand new set that is going to be legal, so I know many of you are getting ready for that tournament and kind of want an idea of exactly how the format is going to shape up. But with that being said, let's hop right into it here. I'm going to be starting off with a lot of the decks that have been getting the most talk recently. We're going to start off with Lugia here. Lugia is incredibly powerful with the addition of the Legacy energy, also potentially playing the Wellspring Ogre Pawn as well. I think that this deck has a lot more flexibility. Still can play, things like the Shinchinos, but, gaining that Legacy energy is just so strong. Makes it so that you can hit turn 2 hands actually relatively consistently as well. You can play things like Roseanne's backup as well to get it back. And like overall is just an insanely powerful card. So I think Lugia is really good. Definitely think that it has a lot of decent matchups, and I think is one of the strongest decks in the format. That's for sure. Next up here, we're going to go over some of the other brand new decks that have been getting a lot of talk recently. We're going to start off with Dragapult Xatu. This is my favorite variant of pretty much the 4 to 5 variants of Dragapult that you can play. I like Xatu the most. Like being able to draw cards is very nice. I think Dragapult has a lot of solid matchups, can play potentially multiple Temple of Sinnoh or things like Enhanced Hammer to make the Lugia matchup better. I think that matchup is incredibly close actually. So being able to go like 50-50 against a deck that I would say Lugia might be the most popular deck like at the beginning of the format just because people have cards for it. I think like being able to go 50-50 against that is pretty nice, especially if you play things like the Temple of Sinnohs. I think this deck is great. I think that like being able to spread damage is just like so powerful. Like 200 being able to two-shot pretty much anything in the format is just crazy good. Things like Scoop Up Cyclone as well are very solid in a deck like this as well. So overall, deck's great. Not a whole lot else to say on it. I definitely expect it to perform very well at the upcoming major tournaments. Next up here, we got Greninja. I think Greninja is decent. I think Dragapult might be the better spread deck though, like overall. However, if a lot of people start to play things like the Blissey, then maybe this deck actually moves up to tier 1 potentially, because this deck hits Blissey for weakness, and I know a lot of people have been hyping up the Blissey because of the fact that it does so well versus things like the Dragapult. So I think that Greninja is pretty cool. Definitely has been one of the more fun decks in the format that I've been working on, and I definitely think actually has a lot of potential. It's just a very solid card in my opinion. Next up here, we got none other than Blissey. Now, a lot of you have been hyping this deck up. I'm not so certain on how good this deck is going to be. Because yes, it does well against things like the Dragapult. However, its matchups against anything that can one-shot it is very bad. So for example, when you play against a Lugia that gets a Shinchino going and they just one-shot your Blissey, there's not a whole lot that you can do about that. When you play against things like the Greninja deck as well, they hit you for weakness. When you play against things like a Dialga deck that can easily hit 300-400 damage, there's not a whole lot that you can do about that. So I think this deck is fun. I think this deck is cool. However, I think it's probably going to be in tier 3 as of right now. It's a cool deck. Yes, I know that it's been, doing well in some tournaments. It does farm Dragapult pretty well. However, I think that it loses to a lot of the rest of the format. It's a cool deck though. Monkey Dory as well is a really cool combo that you can do with it. It's a fun deck. It's solid. I don't think it's necessarily in the fun tier. Maybe it's at bottom of tier 2 potentially. I would say like if there was a tier 2.5, that's probably where like it would probably go. But as of right now, I'm going to put it in tier 3. It's a fun deck though for sure. Next up here, we got Raging Bolt with Teal Mask. I think this deck is just a solid tier 2 deck. I don't think that Teal Mask is that much better than Sandy Shocks, because I feel like the Sandy Shocks variant never really had a problem hitting major numbers. And yes, the Teal Mask does like help out having a little bit more of an early aggression in the early game. However, I don't think it necessarily moves the deck up from tier 3 to tier 1 or from like tier 2 to tier 1. I think it's just a solid like tier 2 deck. Nothing necessarily too special, but I think the deck is solid. Next up here, we got Snorlax. Snorlax is still a menace in the format. Gaining the new Flute card is absolutely crazy. Has pretty good matchups against things like Dragapult, pretty much a lot of like other decks that are going to see a lot of play, you just do pretty solid against things like Chen Pao, Charizard. There's just so many things your deck just has incredibly skewed matchups against. The Lugia matchup is definitely quite scary. However, I think it is close if you play 3 to 4 Temple of Sinnoh and potentially something like the Giacomo as well. I think that could, you know, definitely make the matchup close. But yeah, no, this deck's a menace still. I think this deck is incredibly powerful, and I think is still going to see a lot of success. It just gets, you know, significantly better with the brand new set, and I definitely would respect this deck heading into NAIC for sure. Next up, let's hop into Dialga. Dialga is still a tier 2 deck. I think this deck is quite solid. You know, potentially if there was a 1.5, I would probably slide like right into there. I think this deck is decent. You know, being able to hit things for a bunch of damage is just good. You know, Star Chronos is just an incredibly powerful attack. I think your Dragapult matchup is close. I think especially like if you're able to win the coin flip and go first, then I think you're probably slightly favored. The annoying thing is though, is with Dragapult's existence, you have to play the 70 HP Beldums as opposed to the 60 HP ones, and the 60 HP has that first attack that is like very, very nice to put a card on top of the deck. So that's kind of a bummer, just because of Dragapult's existence. You kind of have to play maybe a 2-2 split or maybe 370 160 potentially, which is kind of annoying, but I still think this deck is very good for sure. Next up, we got Chen Pao. I don't think Chen Pao's dead. I know a lot of people have been like, oh, like Dragapult just destroys it. Dragapult definitely does decently, you know, versus the Chen Pao deck. However, I think that Chen Pao is still a very, very solid deck in general. Beats up on a lot of decks that are probably still going to see a lot of play, and I think the deck is still good overall. Next up, we got Charizard as well. I don't think Charizard has died too. Like anyone saying that the Dragapult matchup is the only reason that the deck is bad, I don't think is necessarily correct. I think, yes, the Dragapult matchup is not incredible. However, I think it's potentially salvageable if maybe you add in things like Radiant Serena as opposed to Radiant Charizard in your deck. I think there's potentially some other cards you could play to kind of fix the Dragapult matchup and at least make it closer. And I think the deck is still solid. Okay, the next step here, we're going to hop into Ancient Box. Ancient Box, I think, is still solid. Definitely can beat most of the top decks in the format. Has a decent stall matchup. Has an okay Dragapult matchup as well. I think if you find Penny at the right time to heal the damage off the bench, I think you're okay. Its Lugia matchup is also relatively okay as well. I think Ancient Box is definitely still solid for sure. Next up here, we got Palafin. I think Palafin is a cool deck. I think that someone is going to figure out how to break the deck, though. I think the deck definitely has a lot of potential. It's just that I personally haven't been able to figure out the right list for it. It has been doing okay in some of the Japan events, not necessarily exceptional, but I think this deck could definitely have some success. I think if someone like figures out the right way to build it. Luxray Pidgeot, I think is just a fun deck. I think that Pidgeot EX with Luxray EX is not necessarily great. I think playing Luxray V is probably just the better control archetype instead. So that would probably be the variant that I would play. Speaking of control, I think probably control goes at the bottom of tier 2. It's, you know, a solid deck for sure. Definitely a lot of options as well. But I'm not necessarily convinced that the Luxray EX is actually very good. I think that probably Luxray V is just an overall better card. You can also Seal Stone it too, so it definitely has a lot more uses. So I personally prefer the regular, you know, control variant with things, you know, like the Wigglytuff, the Radiant Charizard, the Luxray V, and stuff like that. Miraidon. Okay, this is going to be probably very controversial as well. This deck is not amazing. I know a lot of people have been hyping this deck up. However, it's very, very prone to things like Jamming Tower. Yes, it just won the Champions League, which had over 2,000 players. However, I think a lot of its matchups against the top decks are not as good as people think. I think that if Lugia plays double to triple Jamming Tower, like being able to shut off that baton on hands is very bad. I think if, you know, like Dragapult like ends up playing it, doesn't feel great. I don't think Snorlax is a great matchup as well. I think if Charizard rises a little bit more in popularity again, once people realize that Dragapult's not taking up 30% of the formats, then I think that Miraidon also gets hit down a little bit as well. I don't think this deck is incredible. I think it's okay, but I think it's very prone to people kind of adjusting their lists. I think that if you want to make Lugia versus Dragapult 50-50, or not Lugia versus Dragapult, Lugia versus Miraidon 50-50, just add in something like the Jamming Tower, because Jamming Tower, you will see, is just so strong against their deck, you know, like not being able to attach the rescue board like onto something like the Tatsuguri, like that can potentially get stuck, so they can't find supporters. So maybe something like a hand disruption card like slows them down, like when they push up the hands in the active, you just one shot the hands and put down something like a Jamming Tower, and then they can't use the baton because Flaffy's already rotated, so they can't really necessarily like load up a whole bunch of energies as well. Like there's just a lot of problems with this deck. I think the deck is decent. However, I think if people prepare for it, it's not as good as people think it is. Next up here, let's go into Lost Tina. I think Lost Tina is still solid, definitely is a good deck. Out of the Lost Zone variants, probably has the best Dragapult matchup out there, just because you can focus more or less on using your Giratinas. So I think that that's probably correct. You could potentially even now play things like Max Belts, so you can Lost Impact for 330, and you also use things like Requiem and be able to kind of run through the Dragapults potentially. That's something that you could do, so maybe could be consideration for sure. I think this deck is still quite decent. We're gonna put a bunch of decks into fun tier here. Let's just move all of these into fun tier. All cool decks in my opinion, but I think that their time is not yet. I mentioned Arbok here. I think Arbok is a little bit too hard to set up. I think it's a cool deck, however, getting it set up is definitely a major chore. So that's something else as well that I think is a problem. I do think the deck has some potential though. I definitely do think that if someone builds the right list, someone could definitely see some success with it, but I think it's just kind of inconsistent and kind of hard to actually pull that off, which is I think a big problem with the deck at the moment. So I'm gonna move some of these decks into the fun tier. If you disagree, feel free to put that in the comments. Feel free to let me know, fight for your deck for sure. All right, next up here we got Gouging Fire. Gouging Fire has been seeing some success in Japan. I just think the deck is pretty linear. Doesn't necessarily do great against things like Lugia. Shinshinos just blow up the Gouging Fires, which is just really, really bad. If Chen Pao still exists, I don't think that matchup is good. Decks like Charizard as well, I think do pretty decently into the deck too, so I think it's okay. It's just kind of a big two-prize deck that deals a bunch of damage. I think that Miraidon might just be kind of the better deck that does that, simply because you have something like the Iron Hands, so I guess that's why I'll put that there. Next up here, we got some of the Arceus variants. We got Arceus Giratina, Arceus Armarouge, Arceus Pidgeot, Arceus Regidrago. I think Drago probably goes bottom of tier 3 or in the fun tier for sure. Arceus Giratina I think is okay. It's just kind of an average deck. Judge punching, having access to Giratina is good. I do think this deck does decently into things like Dragapult, just because all of your main attackers have a bunch of HP, so it can be kind of difficult to deal with. However, this deck doesn't really do well against things like Lugia. Its Charizard matchup is okay. Its Blocklax matchup is good, but things like Chen Pao, Lost Zone Giratina, Miraidon does pretty decently into it. It's just like an average deck. I think it's okay, but I wouldn't put it necessarily any higher than tier 3. Next up here, yeah, we got Arc Fire as well. I think it's just another tier 3 deck. Pretty much most of the Arceus variants, in my opinion, are just kind of average decks. Not necessarily too much wrong with them, but not really super special in any way, so put those there. Lost Zone Toolbox. I think Lost Zone Toolbox is still good. Yes, despite Dragapult being popular, I still think Lost Zone Toolbox can potentially beat that matchup. Things like turn 2 Radiant Greninja, turn 2 Sableye, just a lot of those combos are just insanely powerful, and if you're able to pull them off, you can beat pretty much anything. You have okay matchups into things like Snorlax, and also Lugia as well is a pretty solid matchup, because you have things like Raikou and also Iron Hands, pretty decent matchup as well, especially if Lugia is so popular. Then a Lost Box I think definitely gains a big boost, because I think Lost Box does pretty good versus the Lugia matchup. So Lost Box is good. I definitely think Lost Box is still good, and I think people are writing it off way too early. I think people see Dragapult's attack and say, oh, this kills Chen Pao and Lost Box, when in reality it doesn't actually do that. So anyways, Lost Box is solid. Next up here, we got Radiant Charizard variant of Lost Box, but at the bottom of tier 2. I think Turbo is just slightly better as of right now. I think it's a little bit more versatile. You have more options versus specific matchups, which I think becomes more important for this format as well, just because there are more decks that are becoming meta decks. So the format's getting more and more diverse, which I think makes having pretty much the package of Roaring Moon, Hands, and stuff like that, like Hoopa as well. Just kind of having that package, I think, is very, very important. So yeah, anyways, Comfy, Lost Zone Zard deck, it's pretty decent, not necessarily overwhelming in any way, but I think it's okay. The Teal Mask decks are fun decks. They're okay. They are quite fun, but I don't necessarily think they're exceptional. The Goldango as well is okay. I think Goldango Palkia might just be the better variant. Goldango Palkia is okay. Definitely don't think it's incredible, but I think it's a solid deck for sure. I definitely need to put more time into this deck. Definitely. So next up here, we got some of the other Dragapult variants. Dragapult Lost Box, I don't necessarily think is that much better than a lot of these decks here. I think it's just kind of average. I think that the Lost Zone engine with Dragapult isn't great. I think that you take a relatively mediocre mirror match versus a lot of the other Dragapult decks, just because you need to set multiple comfies on the field to be able to function. That's just a bunch of liabilities, and that doesn't feel good. So I think this deck is okay, but I don't necessarily think is the strongest Dragapult variant, that's for sure. Dragapult Pidgeot, I think, is quite good. This variant of the deck I actually like. I think this is going to be one of the more popular ones, along with also Dragapult Charizard as well. Both of these variants I think are quite good. I personally think the Xatu one is probably just a little bit better, just because I think of the consistency purposes, but I do think the Pidgeot one is also good. My only issue is that you need multiple stage 2s on the field to be able to function. Yes, things like Charizard is able to do that, but Dragapult doesn't have something that, you know, puts on a bunch of energies onto it. You still have to like manually find the energies and stuff like that. So that's, you know, kind of an issue that you sometimes run into. I think you can play the Mela card that allows you to attach fire energies and stuff like that. You could potentially do that with the Pidgeot variant because you can search it out with the quick search. However, I think these variants are just slightly weaker than the Xatu variant. I think the Xatu variant's a little bit more well-rounded overall, but I do think they're both good. The one argument I think for the Charizard variant is the Miraidon matchup is significantly better. I think the Miraidon matchup is actually pretty favored for the Charizard variant, just because at the moment with how these Miraidon lists are, you know, kind of being built as of right now, they don't really have any answer to a Charizard with 330 HP except using something like the Raichu, and then that takes up so many energies, and then you just like knock out the Raichu, and at that point they kind of run out of steam. So I think the Charizard variant definitely does a lot like better versus something like the Miraidon deck. I think Miraidon, as I said, is not necessarily the greatest deck. However, I think a lot of people are going to play it heading into the North American International Championships. So having, you know, potentially that Charizard definitely has a lot of merit. The issue is though is that you're a little bit more kind of inconsistent, and you have to set up another stage 2, which can be kind of awkward as well. So overall, I think both of the Dragapult variants, or actually all three of them, being the Pidgeot, Charizard, and the Lost Zone variant as well, definitely have merit in their own right, but I think the Xatu one is a little bit of a safer pick. We got the Apple deck. Yes, this deck. It's cool. I don't think the Dragapult matchup is great. I think that's the biggest thing holding this deck back. It's fun for sure, but I definitely wouldn't put it higher than tier 3 as of right now. We definitely need to see some results from it first. We haven't seen a ton of results from it at some of the Japanese tournaments, and we're going to put it in tier 3 as of right now. Roaring Moon as well, I think, is just worse Ancient Box. Just an average deck for sure. Not necessarily much else to say about it. I do think Charizard Barrel actually is not terrible, because I think you're a little bit better against things like the TM de-evolution. So I'm going to give Charizard Barrel a shot in this format. I think this deck is actually not terrible, especially if so many people are playing Dragapult. Maybe Dragapult does reach 20 to 25% of the format, and then maybe the Barrel version gets a little bit more like potentially of a boost, because it is better against those variants than the Pidgeot variant. So, you know, maybe this deck has a chance. I haven't necessarily put a whole lot of work into this for post rotation, but I think this deck definitely could surprise some people. Future Hands is not amazing. I think Miraidon is probably just a little bit better as of right now, but you know, Future Hands is, I think, just an average deck. I'd have it in tier 3 pretty much in both formats, the format of Pass and then also this format. It's just an okay deck, nothing super special. The Teal Mask Ogre Pond kind of box deck, I don't think it's necessarily amazing. It's definitely fun though, for sure. And then also we have the Armarouge variant of this, and then this is kind of hard to rate, because I think that most of these Dragapult decks can play the Tatsugiri, specifically this one, so we're just not going to put this here. We're just not going to include that, because I kind of view this deck pretty much along with that. So we're not going to include that one. Gardevoir is quite good with the Monkey Dory. I think it has a lot of potential. I think it's going to get even better once Miraidon, as I expect, will eventually start to drop a little bit more in play. I think that, you know, Gardevoir gets a lot better because Gardevoir's worst matchup, I think, is the Miraidon deck. But I think this deck is good. I think it's very, very solid. I think has a lot of potential moving forward. The Monkey Dory is just an insane card. Works really nicely with the deck. Great Tusk Fun. Greninja Pidgeot, so we'll just put in tier 3. Raging Bolt as well, I think, is just tier 3. I think the Teal Mask variant is slightly better, but as I said, they're not significantly that much different. I think they're both just kind of like solid decks overall that like deal a lot of damage. But we'll put that there, and then we'll toss in a couple of these other decks, things like a Spather, I think, kind of just sit in that tier 3 as well. Palkia as well, and then we'll move these two here too. So anyways, that's going to do it for the video. Shout outs a brand new Mac as well for making this tier list. These are kind of my thoughts heading into the upcoming Twilight Masquerade format. Let me know what you think of this list. The comments are open for you to discuss, and if you're looking for any of these Pokemon TCG cards, make sure to go check out GameGridSLC.com. You can use my code SMARTTCG. The link will be smack dab in that description, so make sure to go check that out. But anyways, that's gonna do it for me today. Thank you so much for all the support as always. I appreciate it. If you enjoy the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. But with that being said, this is SmartTCG, and I'll speak with you again soon. Peace out.